Okay, so we're going to do an AO2 essay now, thinking about virtue ethics and human nature. Now, this is probably one of the more difficult AO2 questions that you might get in the exam, and they can ask you the question in a number of ways. So what we're going to do first is go through how to structure your AO2 essays, and then we'll think about how they might ask you this question in the exam, and then go through some of the possible answers. So in terms of your structure for a successful AO2 essay, remember you don't need to write an introduction, but you do need a clear conclusion which follows on from your argument throughout the essay. And don't use the word I think, I agree. We're using the words in conclusion, the evidence would suggest. That's just a much more academic way of writing an essay rather than using the word I or me. Remember then that we need 3 arguments for, 3 arguments against, and that those arguments should be linked. So in other words, we want an argument and a counter-argument to the same point. And try and show a clear line of argument by starting each paragraph with phrases like a strong argument, a weak argument, most people would say, a few people would say, and so on. And please remember to use an example in each and every paragraph to develop each of your points fully. Can't stress it enough, you must use examples in your AO2 essays as well as your AO1 essays. So what does this question actually ask for? What's it about? Virtue ethics and human nature or human character. What is that actually about? Well, virtue ethics is all about developing a desired human character or human nature with particular virtues. So it's not asking whether particular actions are right or wrong. It's asking, what kind of person should I be? What kind of character do I need to develop? And therefore, the question really is asking, does virtue ethics assume then that we all agree on what that desirable character is, what that kind of ideal human nature is? And it also is asking, do we actually agree on what the virtues are? Do we agree that the virtues that different ethicists come up with are actually virtues which we would consider to be desirable and part of an ideal character, an ideal person? And if we all do agree on what the ideal human character is and what virtues we should develop, then that's fine, there's no problem there. The problem is if we start to disagree, and actually we disagree with what kind of person we should be and what virtues we need to develop. So that's really what this whole kind of area of questioning is about. And they might ask you it in a number of ways. So I've given you 3 here. Virtue ethics requires us to agree on an ideal human nature. Do you agree? So that's a very general question. Do you agree that there is in order for virtue ethics to work, that we all need to agree on an ideal human nature or human character? Virtue ethics is based on an assumption that we agree on an ideal human character. Again, similar question, just asked in a slightly different way. And then this was last year's question. Friendship, although you could change that for any virtue really, is the most important virtue to develop. How far do you agree? Now again, it's asking, are there particular virtues which we all agree are essential? If you want to be a virtuous person, are there particular virtues which we all agree that you must develop? And so here it's asking about friendship in particular. And so if you were answering that question, what you would need to consider is, well, do different virtue ethicists say that friendship is important? Well, yes, they do. Why would friendship be important? Well, it's important in order for us to better society, which at the end of the day is what virtue ethics is all about. That is the goal of virtue ethics, is to become virtuous so that you develop society and that you better society. Arguments against might be something like, well, virtue ethicists come up with lots of different virtues, not just friendship, so it's not that friendship is the most important. You might argue that other things are more important. For example, you might argue that justice is more important than friendship because, perhaps being just is more important than being friendly in order to better society. If everybody was just friends, then perhaps we wouldn't have justice because people would be looking out for their friends rather than looking to do what is right and just. So that's a couple of ways that you might answer that question. So what we're going to do is we're going to answer the second of those three questions. So virtue ethics is based on an assumption that we agree on an ideal human character. Do you agree? Now what we're going to do is we're going to have three arguments for, three arguments against, but we're going to do an argument for and then a counter argument against. So the first one that we could say is that for Aristotle and McIntyre all suggest that the same virtues are desirable characteristics of an ideal human. And because all three of them do this, because all three of them suggest the same virtues, this would then suggest an assumption that we all agree that these are important characteristics of an ideal human person, a human character. So for example, they all talk about justice, honesty and courage, suggesting that they assume that we all agree that these are essential to an ideal human character. In other words, they are assuming that we agree that justice, honesty and courage are three characteristics of an ideal human character, an ideal human nature. So they're assuming that we agree with them there. So moving on to our first counter-argument then, what we could say in response to that suggestion that they all agree on three of the same virtues, we could say, well actually Aristotle comes up with 12 moral virtues, and so he comes up with many more desirable characteristics of an ideal human that Foote and McIntyre don't come up with. And so this would suggest that virtue ethics does not require us all to agree on an ideal human character, as each theory disagrees slightly with each other on what that human character would look like. So for example, Aristotle suggests pride is a virtue which Foote and McIntyre do not mention. So moving on to our second argument for the question, that virtue ethics is based on an assumption that we agree on an ideal human character. Foote, McIntyre and Aristotle all suggest that that the goal of becoming virtuous is to better society. So in other words, they are assuming that everybody agrees that in order to be an ideal human, that you need to share that goal. You need to also agree that the goal of that your goal is to better society. So for example, McIntyre defines a virtue as something which sustains our communities. In other words, he's assuming that we should all believe the same goal. If we want to be virtuous, what he means by being virtuous or having virtues are things which help our community. And so he's suggesting, well, he is assuming that we would all agree, because if we are wanting to become virtuous, we need to agree that that is our goal, to better society. But as a counter-argument to that, McIntyre and Aristotle both do recognise that virtues and the aspirations of societies will change relative to time and location. So obviously Aristotle was writing a long, long time before McIntyre, and so therefore their kind of lists of virtues and their goals for society are slightly different. And so what that says to us then in response to this question is that they don't assume that there is an absolute ideal human character, in other words, an ideal human character that will not change, only that there is an ideal human character relative to time and to location. And so therefore, in response to the question, you could argue, well yes, they do assume that there is an ideal human character, but that ideal human character is not always the same, and so therefore there is an element to which we can disagree with the statement. So for example, Aristotle mentions that pride is a virtue, whereas now we wouldn't see pride as a virtue. In fact, we'd probably see pride as being a vice. But that just illustrates that, you know, when he was writing, pride was a virtue. It was a desirable characteristic of an ideal human character, whereas now it isn't. And so what that's showing is that there is not this assumption that that ideal human character will always remain the same. It might change. So then our third argument for the statement that virtue ethics is based on an assumption that we agree on an ideal human character is this idea that McIntyre suggests that we live in a moral vacuum characterised by individualism. So we're all out for ourselves, everything that we do is kind of selfish, we're not really interested in others, we just want to help ourselves. And he suggests that to get out of this moral vacuum, we've got to develop virtues and work to better our community. And by suggesting this, he assumes that we all agree that an ideal human character is one that wants to get out of the moral vacuum. by suggesting that as the basis of his theory, he is assuming that we would all agree with him, that is what an ideal human character is, one that wants to get out of the moral vacuum. So our final point here is that McIntyre's assumption that we all want to get out of the moral vacuum is just unrealistic in today's society, and an assumption that an ideal human character must involve a desire to get out of the moral vacuum is just unrealistic. We're individualistic in today's society, and we're individualistic for a reason, because people like being individualistic, and so he puts too much emphasis on assuming that an ideal human character involves a desire to get out of the moral vacuum. Aristotle, however, talks about bettering the self and the community. So whilst McIntyre's definition of virtue is something which sustains our communities, for Aristotle it's about bettering yourself in order to reach eudaimonia for yourself, and in turn helping society to reach eudaimonia as well. And so they disagree with each other here, which shows that there is not an ideal human character involving a desire to just to better society. It's about bettering society and the self for Aristotle, and so therefore there is a disagreement there, showing that there is not an assumption of what an ideal human character involves. So then finally, I've just included a couple more arguments for and against that you could include. So Foot and Aristotle suggest that the middle way, the golden mean, is the ideal human character, and so again there is an assumption that there is an ideal human character, and it's one which kind of aims for the middle ground in all situations. All your actions are, down the middle, and they assume that we all agree with this. But what about people who enjoy things like adrenaline sport? That's not necessarily the middle way. Jumping out of a plane is not necessarily acting in a kind of prudent way. It's quite a dangerous thing, but would we necessarily say that they're bad people? Not really. Certain virtues such as friendship are vital to reach the goal of bettering society, and so not only do they assume we agree with this goal, but they also assume that we agree with the virtues required to get there. So if they are assuming that we want a better society and that they're telling us what virtues we need to develop in order to get there, they're both assumptions that we agree with them there. Other arguments against, we do all identify certain people as virtuous, like Gandhi, Martin Luther King. If you ask people, name a virtuous person, they always come up with the same people. And so therefore, we do agree on an ideal human character. It's not an assumption, it is a reality. We do agree on an ideal human character, because if people came up with lots of different virtuous people, then maybe that would be an assumption, but the fact that everybody kind of comes up with the same ones shows that it's not an assumption, it is actually reality, that we do have an ideal human character in mind when we think of virtuous people. And following on from that, religion also identifies a certain human character as ideal, and that's highlighted in religious figures like Jesus. So again, it's not an assumption, it's a reality that we do agree on an ideal human character. You've also got others that you can look at in your revision guide as well.